So a quick opening remark, we're talking about Demons Part 2, but if you didn't know, there's kind of a controversial chapter that's going on here, not only for its content, but also for where it's placed. When Dostoevsky attempted to write this and send it past the censors, if you will, his cat cough, basically, he basically got struck down on this chapter. So if you have 10 chapters in Part 2, you don't even have this missing chapter. It's gone. Right. And if you're reading, for example, P.V. and Volhonsky, it's at the end. We're going to cover that in a separate video so that way it doesn't spoil anyone who hasn't read it. And we'll have a separate video coming up next in the playlist down below to discuss T-Cones. So today we're covering Part 2 minus at T-Cones.
Oh, man, you have me so intrigued. Like this, it hypes you up, right? Because you're like, wait a minute, what am I missing? What do I not know? And I wonder... I mean, as somebody that only has, the 10 parts, how much different of experience do you have it if you read all 11? Does it change the outcome or the feel of the rest of the book?
It's pretty changing on the character view, which is why I want to get your before and after shot with why we broke it up this way. So unlike Part 1, where the plot for me is just like 5 sentences of like, yeah, I can't really explain this. Yeah, there's confusion over this, why Captain Lebyadkin is getting this money. At least we have plot and we have more clarity. We're peeling back the onion. We're getting closer to the understanding of what's happening behind the scene in this book of secrets and shadows, if you will.
I think there's a lot of the shadows pushed back. There's a burst of sunshine that is shone down on a lot of the characters and the plot development. I loved Part 2, even missing the secretive chapter. I think that there is a lot done for character progression of the story of where is this going and what is Dostoevsky's point, in my opinion, of what he was trying to accomplish with the novel is definitely revealed in Part 2.
Yeah. We open up after the slap, right? It's been 8 days roughly. Nikolai is kind of shuttered up, kind of in his own, living on his own, segregated from the world. And we get to see the rumors of the town. This felt like a very Tolstoyan way of exploring how society reacts to events. But eventually, Pyotr comes in and basically says, hey, man, and goes on one of those like verbal blehs that Pyotr has. Like, do you notice that? Like, whenever Pyotr comes on the scene, it's like if this were a soccer game, he's got 90% possession of the talking wand, while like Stavrogin gets maybe like 10% of the talking time.
Oh, yeah. Pyotr is the Star Wars crawl. He has all of the dialogue to explain everything. He's giving you all the context so you know what's going on. I like him for that. I think that it's kind of ingenious the way that that's written into the story because every time he comes on, you're going to get some juicy info.
Mm-hmm. And if you've got a good translation with good footnotes, you'll see that there's lots of references to German materialist tracts and stuff like that in terms of materialism of basically being we're all atoms and stuff like that. But he's always got these secrets, right? Like in terms of these stories of this factory of the Spulgen men, or however you pronounce it. I'm sorry, we're going to murder words if you didn't know already, of riots and stuff like that. But he seems to be the orchestrator more so than being a member is one way of looking at it.
Why do you think that is? Do you think that's because of his age or his position? Because it feels like that he could be the orator of everything.
I know too much of what happens with this novel, so I can't tell you how I felt in Part 2.
Oh, okay.
I will say this. We know that he's organizing stuff. We know that he's got these 5 men, and there could be orders of 5 all over Russia. Is he at the center? Is he not? We don't know at this point in time, but we do know that Pyotr is driven towards some end almost. This chaos, this destruction that is just stuck in people's lives. I want to get into the characters, but let's go through the plot here. Because basically what might be confusing, I think, to some people is Stavrogin goes out into the night, right? He heads to Krylov's and he's basically asking him to be his second. And no, you didn't miss much. Like, what's this duel? If you remember, basically in the beginning of Part 1, there was that guy that's like, you can't pull me by the nose.
Yeah.
that guy's son, Artemy, he's the one that's kind of spreading rumors, is upset about maybe the disrespect that his father had received. And so basically Stavrogin's going to accept a duel with this individual. You didn't miss much. It's very quick. And there's also these like letters that aren't brought to light yet, right?
Yeah, so we have the duel set up, and he's going to ask for his second, and then...
Well, then we head upstairs to Shetov's, right? Where we're like, hey, Pyotr's totally going to kill you, just so you know. Like, just dropping that casually. Oh, and then, by the way, before I go, let's talk about God and nationalism. Like, that's a totally normal thing to do in the middle of the night when I couldn't sleep, is to warn people that they're about to be murdered and then start talking about life and death with God.
Well, that is kind of... when I have my best thoughts is in the middle of the night, I wake up and I'm like, let me contemplate life here at 2 a.m.
Yeah. See, now had Shatov actually created that book that captures all of the Russian consciousness, he would have seen that coming. I'm joking. All right, bad joke. All right. So Fedka, we leave and we run into Fedka for the first time. And Fedka, it's like, what are the chances of running into you on the bridge? And he's like, oh, it's cool. Pyotr sent me. I can take care of your problem. Hint, hint, weak, weak. Like, I could just take out the Lebyadkins from your life. And it's like, what do you mean by take out? You mean like the dinner, or you mean like, right? It's kind of ambiguous, total, but he's like, no, get away from me. If I see you again, I'll tie you up and throw you to the cops, right? And we head over to Lebyadkin, and that's where it becomes more and more official through this that he's just like, okay, yeah, Maria is my lawful wedded wife, your sister, and the money train's going to stop because instead of me paying you for all this, I'm now going to come clean. I'm now going to go public with my marriage with Maria, and I will just take care of her from there, basically, is kind of his promise. And he heads up to see Maria, and that's when she's just like, oh, is that a knife in your hand? Where's my Prince Harry? I don't know you. Get out of here. And it's very ambiguous. Like, did he have the knife? Did he not have the knife? Like, what did she see exactly? It's very Dostoevsky to leave it up to the reader to try to parse through what we think Stavrogen was doing. Because if he had a knife, right, does he have these unconscious, subconscious thoughts of, taking her out to dinner?
Yeah. I think that, to me, I felt like he had the knife. I don't know why, from her view, it would have been something that was implied, that, I don't know, the killing of their relationship or the killing of their societal clout, because this is going to be kind of the downfall of them when this all comes to light because of, how society was arranged in Russia at this time period. I don't know. Maybe it is a metaphor, but it felt too real in the story to just be fictionalized in her mind.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so he leaves from there, and who do we stumble on the way out but our boy Fedka again? And here's where we have, again, another interesting thing where he's just like, I'll tie you up, and he starts to tie him up, and then he throws money at him and leaves, right? It's almost very reminiscent of some other interactions that we've seen in some other Dostoevsky talks, but we'll get into that a bit more. Because, aren't we just so excited to get to this duel, right, between Artemy and Stavrogen? But then it's very anticlimactic, right? It's just like, we got our boy Artemy over here who can't hit the broadside of a barn. Step all the way up, still misses. And Stavrogen clearly is missing on purpose as he wears his white beaver hat, right? Like, do we have our wild atheistic madman that we saw in the earlier chapters? Or are we seeing a different Stavrogen, right? Like, what's going on here? Like, we see something that just feels off, I would say, which is what makes Stavrogen such an engaging character, is how complex he is.
And I wonder, is this where does he have empathy? Does Stavrogen come to a realization of how precious life is? Does he realize that this is pointless? Does he realize that he's outclassed? That this killing is almost beneath him. I don't know. There's a lot there, but the whole time, all I could picture was like three amigos of one of them shooting up, one shooting up, and one shooting the side and like hitting the barn. Mm-hmm. To your point, to me, I know it seems a little bit lackluster, but it was almost comical of how lackluster it was.
Mm-hmm. Well, for how much it was being built up too, for it just to be like that. And same thing with like that Shetov slap. Like, the resolution of that is very strange. So, in terms of resolutions, when we talk about his wild atheistic playboy years, he had all those girls he was courting, right? Lizaveta being one, and all of a sudden now she's kind of engaged to Mavriki, right? Like Nikolaevich, which again, okay, that kind of happened. But here's what's interesting is what's coming up next is the fete, the gala, the literary gala. And I don't know if you know this or not. I had to bite my lips so hard because when we were recording part 1, you literally said this line. I wrote it down because I thought it would be funny to bring it up again. You said, "Why aren't these people just throwing their parties to make themselves relevant?" You clearly know something about Russian culture, my friend.
Yeah, I've read a few of Dostoevsky's novels, so it's kind of very apparent. But it finally fit that, okay, that's what they're doing.
So Yulia throws the gala, right? And it's kind of funny because you have Varvara that's competing. That's just like, I'm going to throw a party on the same night. Like, it felt very.
I'll get you.
This is aristocracy. Like the horse duel where like the knights would fly at each other with like the lance trying to knock each other off the horse. That's the equivalent of what Yulia and Varvara are doing. Is they're doing the party duel.
A party duel. Okay. I would like to go to either of these parties. I think that would be fun. But I guess it just goes to show of how much different the levels of class mattered in Russia at the time, because you got to think dueling between common people would have been a fist fight outside of a bar, but dueling for upper elites is throwing a fancier party. Isn't that kind of incredible of the level of money or wealth that's kind of being thrown around here, even for Russia at this time period?
Well, or even just knife in the back for the peasants compared to the rigmarole that aristocracy brings, right? In terms of even just how duels are conducted with seconds and how many steps you take and agreements with these parties of who you invite, when you invite them, on what day you invite them. There's so many more rules that come with power and money compared to those that have none of it.
That's a good point. I also think about this of what was... we haven't talked a lot about it, of the point of the whole novel, because we're not finished yet. But Demons seems to be like, is Dostoevsky trying to inform the lower class? I mean, I know that we have the nihilistic stuff. I know we have the political stuff, but there's also a little bit of that commentary on class divide in Russia at the time, because we know how that's going to end up is the fall of the elite and, communism eventually coming to Russia. But is he trying to communicate to the lower classes of how bad off they have it, or how taken advantage of they are? I feel like if the serfs and the lower class could read and they got a hold of this novel, they would have devoured it, feeling like they were being spoken to of, let's rise up above the elites, the aristocracy.
This is, of course, post-serf reform. So this is after they've been, released and they're now peasants per se, right? There's no more serfdom in terms of the timing.
Yeah.
You could take literature the way that you want, but I think what Dostoevsky feels for the peasant class is more compassion, pity, more so than shaking a finger of education or you ought to. I don't know how much is they're doing, right? Because when you look at the Pyotr is kind of not as wealthy as Stepan, and he clearly doesn't have as much power as someone as like the general, right? So when we're talking about Yulia, there's these scenes here where she's hanging out with Pyotr, right? Like she's feeling relevant in the same way that Varvara is trying to feel relevant with the new generation. Hers is one of kind of like entertaining Pyotr's desires and he's the one kind of pulling the strings behind the scenes. And you've got literally what's her husband's title? Is it like general diplomat? I can't remember his exact title, but he's a very upper well-to-do person in the government, right? And he has problems with Pyotr, who's lower class. So I guess this is a good class discussion. I don't know if I'd phrase it the same way that you do, but how does someone with less power and less control influence or change things, right? And maybe it's not they step into the same class and rigmarole that other the aristocracy has, but maybe they have different ways of fighting a change, basically, how to cause a change, essentially. I don't know if his goal is to incite that, but I think People talk about this prophetic vision that Dostoevsky had. And I think they lay that over here. And I think there's a story here, but I don't think that changes the literary merit of this novel, if that makes sense.
Okay, that makes sense. I guess it's easy to draw those parallels because we can insert that prophetic vision because it fits so well with the narrative of, to use your word, change that will come about in the late 19th century and the early 20th century in the Russia and eventually the USSR. So I guess that's why it's so easy to draw that conclusion. Although we're seeing, buy a red car, see a red car type conclusions.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you look at Piotr's, the ending of this chapter 2 to finish the plot summary, is you'll notice that he's going to Kirillov to talk about like, hey, you're going to commit suicide when we want, right? Like, hey, you guys aren't going to tattle or inform the government, are you, for our secret revolution? He's pulling so many strings behind the scenes. Meanwhile, the Virginskys are throwing this party, again, to kind of seem relevant, but they're these nihilistic people who are entertaining things like this, that are getting a kick off of the thrill of radicalizing society, of causing change, of a big difference of how we operate. And that kind of brings it to kind of like a conclusion here where we have kind of like the Shipulgan writers workers beginning to kind of riot and have questions over ownership of property. Who should be owning things when it comes to that? Which were movements that started, clearly decades before, the 1917 revolution and moved forward. And Dostoevsky has no idea where it's going to go, right? But he sees the unrest. He sees the problems of society at a time and uses those to depict how we have discussions of ownership and how we have discussions of change.
And the whole time while I'm reading this, I'm just kind of like he and Han over my my Kindle, and I'm like, just if you guys would all just work together and shut up, you could make this better. And it just feels like the divide is so far that they can't see past each other to make things better. And it's just hindsight's 20/20, of course, but it's just very frustrating from a historian standpoint of just, make this work, because it is a work of fiction. And I just feel like, come on, Dostoevsky, give me the happy ending. I mean, I know he's not going to because that's not him, but one can dream, right?
So let's talk about our boy Stavrogin here, Nikolai. He's an interesting, enigmatic, charming, maybe empty character of some sorts, right? But I think he's the through line to this novel. He's the closest we're going to get, I think, to a hero. And the way that he was, I don't know if you noticed this, but a through line through this whole novel is when he was first introduced in part 1, it says, one would have thought that he must be a paragon of beauty. Yet at the same time, there seemed something repellent about him. It was said that his face suggested a mask. So in the beginning, we're introducing this character of beauty, of leadership, of almost awe-inspiring kind of, but it's a mask. So you as a reader, a Dostoevsky reader, must start asking the question, why? Is this the very simple answer of, oh, we put on a mask to enter society, or we aren't always who we pretend to be? I think Dostoevsky actually has a much more complex story here.
Okay, interesting. So it's not just that we're doing this to shield ourselves or, protect our true inner id, our ego, whatever, from others. So what is his goal then?
Well, let's put it this way. This mask concept that seems to kind of follow Stavrogin. Even in the slap scene, they talk about it. In this part, we have his wife doesn't know who he is anymore, right? Where's my Prince Harry, right? A Shakespeare reference. Why are you carrying this knife? Shatov becomes almost upset. Were you really an atheist this whole time? What about those times in the letters that we shared in America, right? And then you even have Pyotr that finally comes up to him, right, before this missing chapter scene. And we have a quote from him where he says, Stavrogin finally glanced at him and was struck. This was not the same look, not the same voice as always, or as in the room just now. he saw almost a different face. So Pyotr sees a different face, but is it Pyotr doesn't know who Stavrogin is, or is it Stavrogin doesn't know who he is? Because Fedka even has a quote. Very strange character, by the way, just showing up on this bridge. Hey, come on, man, let me stab your wife, bro. Give me some money.
A little random, yes, a little out of left field. But,
random Fedka.
I mean, it fits, though, into all the craziness that is ensuing. So, I mean, it's not out of character, I guess, for the novel.
Yeah. Well, and there's humor to this novel. As dark as it is hilarious, too, at times. But Fedka says of Pyotr, he says he invents a man and then lives with him. How did you take that quote?
I guess that we see what we want to see in people, that when you have a relationship with somebody, it is two ways, but from your perspective, it's only one way that the relationship is going. So that's how you're going to interact with this person. And I guess you go back to Stavrogin is what is his purpose? What is his goal? What is his motive? And I feel like he's so complicated of a character, and I guess I don't want to call him a hero, but he's what we have to see growth, and I guess that's what we're seeing, or the other characters are seeing him is they're seeing his growth, and maybe they don't agree with how he is changing.
I think the time is right to bring up this point now, where if you read the foreword or even some of like the writings and background of this story, why did Dostoevsky write this? There's probably many, many, many different reasons layered over each other. But one of the accounts is when his brother-in-law wrote to him about an infamous story of Ivan Ivanov, okay, which you probably don't know this story. I don't think many people do, but it's something that was highlighted in Dostoevsky's mind. But on November 21st, 1869, Ivanov was murdered as part of the Petrov Academy, a very famous scene that sparked a lot of this novel. And is basically, his murder was ordered by Sergei Nietzschev, a 21-year-old revolutionary nihilist, right? So again, this is starting to sound familiar about some of his writings about this materialism and how we influence the youth. But I guess what Nietzsche's point is, when you asked him why he did it, it was part to solidify a blood pact, a way to get people to work for him. Now go back to that scene with Pyotr, when he's just like, you're not going to inform, right? You're not going to inform. And remember when Shatov leaves and Stavrogin's like, you can't have him. He knows that Pyotr plans to kill him, because by killing him, that makes everyone loyal to Pyotr. By basically buying their allegiance through fear and of constant dread of death for betraying the circle, right? And that's what this Nietzsche was famous for in the papers, is basically the murder of this Ivan Ivanov, who simply changed his mind, right? And that's perhaps our Stavrogin. Is he a character who was an atheist? I don't know. I think so. Is he a character who was a wild man? I don't know. I think so. He did some pretty crazy things, right? And does he no longer think that way? I don't know. I don't have evidence to say that he doesn't, because he's so quiet a lot of the times, right? We don't get the inner monologue that we need of Stavrogin, but we know he's a character that might be no longer aligned with revolutionary ideals, because he says so. He says, I'm not in this group. They just so happen to align with me in certain things, so I just have gone along with them. So is he our character that changes his mind? And if he does change his mind, what does that mean? Right? When he's got a wife, when he's got friends in this group, when he's got family members, do they come under threat? Is it easy just to leave the mob? Right? Like this isn't like quitting a job, right? Like when you're trying to quit this illegal revolutionary circle that clearly would be exiled perhaps to Siberia, if not worse, it's going to cause and cause pause, I guess I should say, before acting. And clearly we see a lot of pause from Stavrogin.
I think we have, to go back to your point of Ivanov, I think we have actually talked about him, maybe off camera we have, because we've done many Dostoevsky novels. And I remember that story of him being almost a martyr to the cause. And I'm very worried that Strovanov is going to be that martyr and that they're going to kill him for the cause. But I just think that...
Wait, hang on. Did you just call him Stroganoff? Stravogin?
Stroke. I'm sorry. You know I mess up these names. But I feel like that he has so much going on in his life that he doesn't know what he wants, and that this is an opportunity for him to be a maybe, because he's trying to figure himself out. He's trying to figure out Russia. I think he's trying to figure out what it means to be Russian. He seems very well educated, and I think that's very noble of him. I'm worried for his life. I don't know if he's going to make it out of the novel alive. Oh,
do you think he knows whether he's changed his mind or not? Because how do you interpret the second scene with Fedka when he's like, "Give me money and I'll stab your wife. I'll take out Captain Lebyadkin," right? When he's leaving, do you remember what he throws at Fedka?
I don't.
He throws money at him. So is he buying Fedka's services to take care of his wife, or is he just acting out in rage, throwing things away? Which one is it? Is his subconscious in control? Is his conscious in control? What does Stavrogin want?
There's obviously many different interpretations you can take from that, but I guess the way that I thought of it is that that's how rich people sometimes solve their problem, is through money. Just throw money at it. That he's throwing money at it to get rid of him. I don't think he's paying him for the services of taking out his wife. That's not how I interpreted it.
So let's move into power a little bit, and I'll explain why. But power in Russia at this point in time, where is ultimate power?
The Tsar.
Right. Now, people like Pyotr, right, who are not, he's not noble born, right? Stepan isn't noble born. He's definitely not, he doesn't come with the power, I guess, Yulia's husband comes with. Let's start there, right? So he's not nearly as powerful as perhaps as some other people, right? So can Pyotr by himself take absolute control? Can he just take over the Tsar? And the answer to that is clearly no, right? Like, you can't just walk in and take out the Tsar as a single dude.
No, clearly not. No, I don't think no matter how high ranking you are, you're going to be able to achieve that. So obviously there's got to be some strategery that goes on.
Well, this is where this novel shines for me, because we've talked about going along in groups for the sole purpose of belonging, of having a sense of social currency, right? Which by itself is not universally bad. I don't think universally, no, right? Because sometimes people join up and they do start to believe. They do start to cause good for certain purposes and stuff like that, that you can't say it's universally bad, right? But that also means you can't say it's not universally not
good.
Yeah.
I see where you're going. Yeah, I'm following along.
So evil and corruption to me are a big part of this. So Pyotr can't cause direct change, but he can influence, right? We've talked about Philip Zimbardo.
A few times, yes.
He wrote a book called The Lucifer Effect that I really enjoyed. And the name Lucifer Effect, where's that come from, right? Because there's the biblical story of basically Satan was an angel, right? He tried to have a rebellion against God, and people who read Dostoevsky, that rebellion word should make your ears perk up. But it's basically, how did good angels become bad and try to rise up and take over from God's power, right? Like, how did good become bad? How did that influence begin? And that's part of kind of the influence behind the Stanford prison experiments. We've talked about that before too. Do you remember those?
Oh, yeah. I actually have seen the videos of those and have shown them to my students in the past before. But I think it's interesting that you bring that up of, the Lucifer Effect, because it is a matter of perspective as well, that we've talked so often on this channel, that when you look at, the devil, and from his perspective, he was looking for, freedom of choice. And I think that a lot of characters in demons, devil demons are looking for choice. They're looking for a way to break out of, traditional Russian society, being locked into, the patriarch, to being locked into, high society, and all of this is how can we break these norms? And that feels like the point of how the novel is moving towards.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. Let's talk about Piotr's introduction, because we talked a lot about Stavrogin and his mask, right? What does he represent? Is he this guy that changed his mind? Is he still the wild man he once was? When Piotr is introduced at the end of part 1, I love this little quote here. It's very subtle, but it says, "His words pattered out like smooth, big grains, always well chosen and at your service. At first this attracted one, but afterwards it became repulsive. Just because of this over-distinct articulation, this string of ever-ready words, one somehow began to imagine that he must have a tongue of a special shape, somehow especially long and thin, extremely red, with a very sharp, everlastingly active little tip." And I couldn't help but kind of focus on this tip, right? Like, you can't help but imagine like a snake or reptile or even devil, forked tongue, perhaps, when you start to imagine Piotr. And I think you get this sense of evil from him, right? The fact that he perhaps is corrupting others potentially, or taking advantage of others who are dissatisfied with their situation, right? And that's what's so interesting about those Stanford prison experiments. For those that don't know, they took 18 students, 9 guards, 9 prisoners, and said, go run a prison, and didn't really give them any direction. Like, they didn't tell them how to be a good guard, what's ethically right to be a guard. They just stuck them in, right? So prisoners do what prisoners do. They try to escape, like on the second day. And they had to guards stop it. They had to start doing push-ups. They had to start being stripped naked. The guards started spraying them with fire extinguishers, really questionable things to put students in, to the point where 4 or 5 of them broke down and had to be yanked out of the experiment earlier for psychological terror. Right. So
they ended the whole experiment early. Remember, they couldn't even finish the whole thing because of how horrific it got. They were beating them, and it's just that your psyche, just like in this novel, of you become what you see or what you're seen as. And I think that's with Piotr, is he's seen as the devil. He's seen as the bad guy, so he's embodying that because that's how people are looking at me. He's like, well, I might as well. That's what they think of me. Why should I try to change it or be any different?
But is it as simple as just there's bad apples? Was Satan just a bad apple, and he influenced some weak-willed people? Is it really that easy? And I think Zimbardo, he puts up a good argument. Yes. He puts up a good argument that no one denies that there's not bad apples. Right? I don't think anyone really disagrees that. But at the same time, I think most people would agree too that there are people who experience both sides, that there's good and power. How did 9 perfectly normal Stanford University students become sadistic torturers in this experiment? And to your point, it's the idea of power that comes into play, the expectation of your role, even, where sometimes when your role requires you to be authoritative or to do certain things that you might consider unethical, you might move forward with it because it's not you, it's your job requiring it, which, again, very predictive of kind of World War II and kind of a lot of the human atrocities that happened there, that it's not just bad apples. It's what you could call a bad barrel, right? If you put a perfectly good cucumber, is it cucumber, into a vinegar batch, right? You're going to get pickles. You can't have a good cucumber come out of a bad barrel of vinegar, right? And it's the same argument with society, right? That is how so many normal, decent people, that as soon as they get power or they get hungry or dissatisfied, that's how the barrel influences you. That's how Lucifer takes over good angels and how good people start to do bad things. There's no such thing as a good person and a bad person. There's good people that make bad choices too.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's I love the analogy of the barrel too that you use, because a barrel you think of is, enclosed, and you can only see and know what is inside of your barrel. And I think that Pyotr is in a barrel, right? He's only seeing what he wants to see, but he's also only seen by those that are inside the barrel with him. And I don't know if that truly makes him evil or not, but it makes him evil-ish, evil adjacent inside of his social circle. And as a result, he's trying to make change. I don't think he's going to make large change on a large scale, because the novel obviously feels a little bit, historical fiction. But he's definitely making some moves, and that seems very the norm for somebody that has gotten a little bit of taste of power that has almost corrupted them to sort of the point of evil. But I don't think he's genuinely evil for evil's sake.
No, I don't either. There's some really good quotes here, how he's just like, well, I'm not actually here to cause the harm. Like, he's just there for the entertainment almost. He, we mentioned earlier, he's not going to go overthrow the Tsar by himself, right? Like, that's not where power is. That's not how power corrupts to the Stanford exhibits, right? It's more about how he can incite unrest when there's already a society that's disenfranchised with their life. Because if you remember, there were strikes that were starting to happen in this novel. Dostoevsky isn't inventing this. He's starting to see this, right? He sees how strikes are starting to happen. And you can see this chart, actually, even from Wikipedia, where they talk about from like 62 to 69, there was an average of 6 strikes, right? And that climbed to 20 in the following decades, then to 33 in the following decades. And then by 1895 to 1905, you've got 176 annual strikes. People are not happy with their circumstance, which makes it easier for them to be influenced by the bad barrel problem, which goes to our earlier point in part 1. We talked about how that Carl Jung quote about how people don't have ideas, ideas have people. Well, here's where you see how Pyotr and Dostoevsky, writing what most people would call prophetically, being the person who's inciting unrest. He's pissing his dad off, who's sitting there with the Chernyshevsky novel sitting there on his TED, like revolutionary material. He's got the German materialism tracks in his apartment. You see the way that he's like sowing the seeds of unrest almost in society.
And that was something very common, I think, this time period as well. You see that across many different nations in the late 19th century. This idea of civil unrest is becoming more and more popular. It's the fad. It's the thing to do at the time. And I don't know if that is a good or a bad thing, but the idea of striking and riots and these radical views as more people are being freed, slavery has ended, serfdom has ended, more people are learning to be able to read and write, newer technologies are allowing us to eat healthier, live longer. I think a lot of those things are all influencing this idea of that the lower classes want better for themselves, and somebody like Pyotr is going to exploit that for maybe good intentions on the back end, but for personal gain in the short term.
Yeah. Well, I think this radicalism and intellectualism challenge is where the heart of this novel is for me in terms of what I enjoyed the most out of it. Because if you think about how do you incite this unrest, right? How do you get people to strike together to form a revolution, right? If that's really our goal, right? Or is it radicalism for the sake of radicalism? But you have to have literature, you have to have tracks, right? And you see plenty of examples of that with the Chernyshevsky novel, with the German materialists. You have Shatov with his printing press, right? And we need funding, right? So that's how we manipulate Yulia into throwing these parties to basically fund the revolution. It's brilliant the way that one man can pull together all these different movements and then almost scapegoat it with this plan. Like, we don't know what it is, but he's just like, okay, Mr. Krylov, you're going to commit suicide. You're super important to my plan. Like we kind of have these hints as to what's going on, but we don't know for sure. Let me ask you as a first-time reader, what are your thoughts? Like, what do you think his radicalism ideas are? What do you think he's trying to push towards, and how is he going to use Krylov in this situation with Shatov?
I don't know what he's pushing towards. I just from like my prior knowledge, I feel like anarchy is too extreme, but definitely a breakdown of the social norms. I feel like that if he can manipulate people in a well enough way, that it would show that the change can take place, that change can happen, and that the right people can make the right changes. And then Russian society is going to have another revolution like the end of serfdom. So I don't know. It feels like it feels like it's too slow going for the novel. And I guess like, where's the pacing of that, of like, how are we going to get to, the finish line?
What are your thoughts on the whole religious element, right? So we have the curse of knowledge of knowing where Russia went after this, decades later, right? With atheism, with the Soviet Russia coming up and basically campaigning, destroying churches. And you have all these quotes from Shatov where he says, to start a rebellion in Russia, one must inevitably begin with atheism. Really bold statement for something that's decades later. But we have all these talks about how the different nations had their different gods, right? The Jews lived only to wait for their true God and left their true God for the world. The Greeks defied nature and bequeathed the world their religion, that is, philosophy and art. Rome defied the nation in the state and bequeathed the state to the nations. France, throughout her whole long history, had simply been the embodiment and development of the idea of the Roman god, and if she had finally flung her Roman god down into the abyss and plunged into atheism, which for the time being they call socialism, that is solely because atheism is, after all, healthier than Roman Catholicism. One paragraph brilliantly just summarizes so many different views there about enlightenment and the movements that are happening about selling out God for the purpose of nature and stuff like that. Like, what do you think about this with basically Dostoevsky's attack on socialism, Dostoevsky's attack on atheism being worse than Roman Catholicism? There's a lot here.
Whew, a lot to unpack. So one, love the quote, amazing. Two, it comes down to nationalism. When I would teach this all the time, I would ask my students, what is nationalism? What does that mean? How do we identify as American, our national identity? And it is always very difficult for students, but we would always come back to, well, we are a free nation. We don't have a king. People get to vote and make choices for their political leaders, or we freed our slaves, or we're good people, and we defeated the evil people in World War I and World War II. It seems to be these big monumental events that help define nationalism. But there was always something else that would always be brought up in our discussions, and it was that of religion. And a lot of people believe that, we are a Christian nation, and that, our national identity revolves around a religion because, as we've talked about many times on this channel, religion is a very important part of many people's lives. And many people, it is the most important part of their life. It defines them. It's what they work towards, what they live by. And as Russians, they are, Russian Orthodox Christians. That is a national identity for Russia. And for them to break the cycle that they're in and have true change, they're going to have to change that identity. And the core root of that identity is Orthodox Christianity. And so for, I think, Dostoevsky, that, breaking that mold is the biggest threat to his society, what his norm is. And because we have, what happens later, we know that that's true. That does happen when Russia changes its national identity based on not only politics and gets rid of its czar, but does become more of a nihilistic, atheist society, moving towards socialism. It does lose its national identity of Christianity. So, I mean, that's very much apparent of what takes place and transpires.
If you look at, there's like a pretty famous, I think it was 2015, 2016 study, the Pew Institute Center or Pew Center, something like that. They did a lot of research into, and I'll put a link, I'll find a link to it, but there's like a lot of research into the national identity and the idea of religion. And a lot of Eastern minded individuals in terms of like Russian Orthodoxy, like you said earlier, they view, if you weren't Russian Orthodox in 2015 even, you could be their neighbor, but you weren't their family. You weren't Russian unless you were Russian Orthodox, right? You had to belong to this organization, again, that currentization, that social currency even in a sense, where I know based on statistics, like a broad stroke, they view belonging as much more important than belief even at times. A broad statement, because here in America, belief almost happens, but we don't have as much belonging per se, like it compared to Russian Orthodoxy. We don't even have as much behaviors perhaps as some other countries too. There's those 3 B's, the belief, behaviors, and belonging. We have different priorities in different regions, broad stroke, but the belonging aspect, I think to your point, is the most important part to a lot of Eastern countries. And while Russian Orthodoxy was one of the biggest ones on that, there were other countries in that too. As you move west into Poland and some of the other more Roman, Western Catholicism states, those are going to be much more on the belief side. And it's very different the way that these two interact and view their neighbors, even because of very small things like this, as religion and your national identity.
And remember, religion is always being attacked by the evolution of religion itself as, religious texts are reviewed and rewritten and translated from one language to another, that religion is going to evolve itself. And I feel that, at this time period, a very tumultuous time period in the world as a whole, not just Russia, but across the world, Dostoevsky's probably feeling a little attacked. And this knowledge that things could change, because he is seeing a little bit of change. I mean, in a microcosm, he's thinking to himself, I can immortalize, what has taken place and transpired in this novel, and almost lock into a piece of history of how if it doesn't change, and again, I haven't read the whole novel, if things don't progress forward the way they are, we don't maybe have the USSR, and that Russia gets to keep its identity of, the God that it sees that binds them together.
Yeah. I remember reading a quote, to your point, that Dostoevsky even commented that he wasn't sure who's the true custodian of Russia's future. Is it the government? Is it the church? Right? Like, who is going to lead Russia into the future? Is it this young nihilistic rising up revolutionaries? And I think Dostoevsky was probably a little bit scared, particularly being more Western in Germany at the time, writing back. I guess I don't know where. He was in Berlin, I think it was. But looking, out from the outside in, if you will, that it could be a little bit scary. Now, one of the things I said that I'd want to do to end each kind of these talks was to mention that the number one question, which is, what is the devil or demons in this story? What does it mean?
I think I've kind of changed my tune a little bit, not to any one individual now. I think that to bring back to your point that you just made is, what does this maybe mean to Dostoevsky? And what it means to me at this point is just people in general. It is that mass mentality. It is that group mob mentality of, we're going to come together and we're going to make it different. And they're coming together. The people, they're the ones, not religion, not the government, not the military, just the people. And that's scary, because you don't know what people are going to do.
That's the truth. We put a lot of effort into this. If you guys want to help us out and leave a comment or like down below to help feed the ever-hungry YouTube algorithm, we'd certainly appreciate it. We're going to have links to Patreon and super thanks, stuff like that if you'd like to participate and help to continue the future of the channel. We appreciate it. Make sure to stay tuned as we prepare to head into that missing secret chapter at T-Cones, as well as the final part 3 wrap-up as we wrap up our discussion on demons. I hope you guys are loving this story as much as we are. Dostoevsky, one of the greatest writers that ever lived. What can I say? Peace out.
Peace.